Welcome to Summarize This. Today, we're exploring one of the foundational texts of political science, Politics by Aristotle. Written around 350 BC, Politics is Aristotle's systematic investigation of political life. Where his teacher, Plato, imagined an ideal city in the Republic, Aristotle takes a fundamentally different approach, one that's empirical, comparative, and grounded in the study of actual political communities. Politics is a collection of 8 books representing Aristotle's lectures and notes on political philosophy, compiled after his death. This accounts for some repetition and occasional contradictions. We're reading working documents from one of history's greatest minds, not a polished final product. These 8 books cover extraordinary ground. They examine the nature and purpose of the state, the origin of political community in the household, systematic critique of previous political theories, comprehensive analysis of constitutional types, the causes of political revolution and stability, practical advice for organizing different regimes, and finally, a vision of the ideal state and the education necessary to sustain it.
For over 2,000 years, politics has shaped how we think about government, citizenship, justice, revolution, and the proper organization of political life. Aristotle essentially invented political science as a systematic discipline, the empirical study of political phenomena to derive general principles and practical guidance. In this comprehensive summary, we'll work through all 8 books systematically. We'll see Aristotle examine real constitutions, analyze power dynamics, explain why regimes collapse, and balance philosophical ideals with practical wisdom. We'll encounter his famous claim that humans are political animals, his classification of 6 constitutional types, his argument for the middle class as the foundation of stable democracy, his penetrating analysis of revolution and regime change, and his vision of education in the ideal state. Whether you're a student of political philosophy, interested in the foundations of Western political thought, or simply curious about how one of history's greatest minds approached questions of government and society, this summary will give you a thorough understanding of Aristotle's political philosophy. Let's begin. Book 1 establishes the philosophical foundations of Aristotle's political thought. Aristotle opens with one of the most famous claims in political philosophy. Man is by nature a political animal. This carries multiple layers of meaning that deserve careful unpacking. First, humans naturally form communities. We don't choose to be social through some social contract or rational calculation. Sociability is part of our nature, as fundamental as rationality or the capacity for language. A human raised in complete isolation would be psychologically damaged, unable to develop properly. This isn't a choice we make, but a feature of what we are. Second, the highest and most complete form of human community is the polis, the city-state. The polis isn't just another association among many, it's the community that enables human beings to realize their distinctive capacities most fully. It's qualitatively different from households or villages, not just larger. Third, the polis exists by nature, not merely by convention or agreement. It emerges naturally from pre-political associations as humans pursue the good life. Just as acorns naturally become oaks when conditions are right, human associations naturally develop toward the polis. Fourth, someone who genuinely lives outside political community permanently and by nature is either a beast or a god. They're either subhuman, lacking the rational and social capacities that define humanity, or superhuman, completely self-sufficient and needing nothing from others. Normal human beings need the polis. This is a profound claim with significant implications. It means political life isn't artificial or optional. It's not something we create merely to serve individual interests that exist prior to politics. Political community is the natural fulfillment of human nature. We're not fully human outside of it. To understand the polis, Aristotle begins with its building blocks. The most basic association is the household, which exists to meet daily needs. The household consists of several distinct relationships, each serving a natural function. The relationship between husband and wife is a partnership aimed at reproduction and mutual support in life. Aristotle controversially claims that the husband naturally rules the wife, but he carefully distinguishes this from despotic rule. This is constitutional or political rule, ruling free persons for mutual benefit, where the ruled also have rationality and agency. The husband doesn't own the wife, as a master owns a slave. However, Aristotle's claim that men are naturally suited to rule and women to be ruled reflects ancient Greek prejudices we now firmly reject. He argues men have more developed deliberative capacity, while women have deliberative capacity, but without authority. This is one of several deeply problematic aspects of politics that we must acknowledge even as we learn from other insights. The relationship between parent and child involves natural authority of parents over children. This is royal or monarchical rule, ruled by one over those who naturally need guidance. Children lack fully developed reason and judgment. They need parental authority for their own good until they mature. This rule is temporary and educational, aimed at developing the child's capacities. The relationship between master and slave is the most controversial aspect of Aristotle's political philosophy. He argues that slavery is natural when there's a natural distinction between those who can foresee with their minds, natural masters, and those who can execute with their bodies but lack the capacity for foresight and planning, natural slaves. A natural slave, Aristotle claims, is someone who can understand reason enough to follow orders, but can't engage in deliberation or practical wisdom themselves. Such a person benefits from being ruled by someone with developed rational capacity, just as the body benefits from being ruled by the soul.
However, Aristotle himself acknowledges a crucial problem. Actual slavery in the Greek world often doesn't correspond to this natural distinction. Many people are enslaved through conquest who aren't natural slaves at all. They're enslaved by force and convention, not by nature. Aristotle admits this, but doesn't draw the obvious conclusion that slavery, as practiced, should be abolished. Modern readers rightfully condemn Aristotle's defense of natural slavery as morally repugnant. It represents one of the most serious failures in his ethical and political thought. The concept of natural slavery has been used throughout history to justify horrific injustices. While we can learn much from Aristotle's political philosophy, we must firmly reject this aspect. The household also involves property and wealth acquisition, which Aristotle analyzes in detail. He distinguishes between two types of wealth acquisition. Natural wealth acquisition seeks what's needed for the good life: food, shelter, clothing, necessary tools, and resources. This is limited and proper, since genuine needs are finite. The skilled household manager knows how to acquire and use resources to enable a household to live well. Unnatural wealth acquisition seeks unlimited accumulation of money for its own sake. This includes retail trade, buying goods to resell at profit rather than for use, and especially usury, lending money at interest to make money from money itself. Aristotle's critique of usury is particularly sharp. Money, he argues, exists to facilitate exchange, to solve the problem of barter by providing a common measure of value. Money is a tool, a means to an end. But in usury, money becomes an end in itself. Money is used to breed more money. This is unnatural because money itself is sterile. It doesn't actually produce anything. The lender makes gain without engaging in any productive activity. This critique of unlimited wealth accumulation versus household management aimed at the good life
has echoed throughout economic thought for millennia. Whether we agree with Aristotle's specific economic views, his fundamental question remains important. Should economic activity be understood as unlimited accumulation, or should it be oriented toward enabling the good life? What is the proper relationship between wealth and human flourishing? Having analyzed the household, Aristotle traces the natural development toward larger communities. Multiple households form a village, a community united for more than just daily needs. Villages enable mutual defense, more elaborate cooperation, some specialization of labor, and collective responses to challenges that exceed any single household's capacity. Finally, when several villages unite, they form a polis. And here, something qualitatively new emerges. The polis exists not merely for life, but for the good life. What's the difference? Households and villages secure survival. They provide food, shelter, reproduction, basic security. These are necessary conditions for human life, but they're not sufficient for human flourishing. The polis makes possible distinctively human excellences: virtue, justice, philosophical inquiry, artistic achievement, political participation, the full development of rational capacity. These activities require resources, leisure, education, cultural institutions, legal frameworks, things only a larger, more complex community can provide. This is why Aristotle says the polis exists by nature. Human beings have natural capacities for reason, virtue, language, and deliberation about justice that can only be fully actualized in political community.
Just as an acorn naturally develops into an oak tree when conditions are right, human beings naturally develop their capacities fully when living in a well-ordered polis. This leads to a striking claim. The polis is prior by nature to the individual and the household, even though individuals and households exist first in time. Aristotle uses an analogy. Consider a whole body and its parts. In one sense, the parts exist before the whole. You can't have a body without parts. But in another sense, the whole is prior. It defines what the parts are and what they're for. A severed hand isn't really a hand anymore, except in name. It can't function as a hand because it's separated from the body that gives it life and purpose. Similarly, individual humans and households exist before the polis chronologically. But the polis is prior by nature because it provides the context in which humans can fully realize their nature. A human completely separated from political community would be fundamentally incomplete, unable to develop language, rationality, and virtue properly. Aristotle observes that humans alone among animals have speech, not just voice, but rational discourse. Animals can signal pleasure and pain, satisfaction and distress, but humans can discuss the advantageous and the harmful, the just and the unjust, the good and the bad. Why do we have this capacity? Because we need it. Unlike bees or ants, which cooperate through instinct, humans must deliberate about how to live together. We have different views about justice, competing interests, disagreements about the good. These must be resolved through reasoned discussion, not just instinct or force.
Politics is the sphere where we use speech to deliberate about common life. We discuss laws, debate policies, argue about justice, deliberate about the city's direction. This is distinctively human, and it's essential. Without the capacity for political deliberation, we couldn't maintain complex communities. Throughout Book 1, Aristotle emphasizes that the polis exists for the good life, not mere life. But what is the good life? It's the life of virtue and rational activity, developing and exercising our distinctively human capacities excellently. It includes moral virtues like courage, temperance, justice, and generosity. It includes intellectual virtues like practical wisdom and philosophical contemplation. It includes participation in political life, engagement with culture and the arts, friendship, and the pursuit of understanding. This good life requires certain material conditions, adequate wealth, health, security, but it's not reducible to material prosperity. Many wealthy people don't live well because they lack virtue or spend their lives in trivial pursuits. The good life is about developing human excellence. And this is why political community matters fundamentally. A well-ordered polis creates conditions for the good life through just laws, good education, cultural institutions, and the framework for cooperative activity. A badly ordered polis prevents or corrupts human development. This teleological understanding that political life has a purpose or end, namely enabling human flourishing, shapes everything that follows in politics. Constitutional forms will be evaluated by how well they serve this end. Good regimes promote virtue and the good life. Bad regimes prevent or corrupt human development.
Having established his foundational understanding of political community in Book 1, Aristotle turns in Book 2 to a systematic examination of alternative political theories and existing constitutions. This represents one of the earliest examples of comparative political analysis. Aristotle's method is thoroughly empirical and critical. He doesn't simply theorize about the ideal constitution in isolation. Instead, he examines proposals from other philosophers and actual constitutions from various city-states, testing them against practical realities and identifying their strengths and weaknesses.
Book 2 divides into two main sections: critiques of theoretical proposals for ideal constitutions, particularly those of Plato and other philosophers, and examinations of constitutions actually implemented and renowned for excellence, particularly Sparta, Crete, and Carthage. Aristotle begins with an extended critique of Plato's Republic, his teacher's masterwork. This is philosophically remarkable, demonstrating that truth matters more than loyalty to one's teachers. Plato's Republic proposes a radically unified city where the guardian class shares everything in common. No private property, no private families, children raised collectively. The goal is eliminating private interests that might conflict with devotion to the city's common good. If guardians have no private property or families, they can't be distracted by personal concerns and will care only for the city as a whole. Aristotle's critique is devastating and multifaceted. His fundamental objection concerns unity. Plato seeks to make the city as unified as possible, assuming maximum unity equals maximum excellence. But Aristotle argues this mistakes the nature of political community. A city is by its nature a plurality. It consists of different kinds of people with different functions, different perspectives, and different contributions to make. Households and individuals are more unified than cities, yet we don't consider them superior forms of community. A city that becomes too unified ceases to be a city at all. Consider the analogy to music.
A melody consists of different notes. If you try to make it more unified by reducing it to a single note repeated endlessly, you don't improve the melody, you destroy it. The beauty of music depends on harmony among different elements, not sameness. Similarly, a well-ordered city achieves harmony among diverse citizens, not homogeneity. Political unity should be unity in diversity, not elimination of diversity. Aristotle identifies practical problems with communal property and families among guardians. Plato thinks eliminating private property will eliminate conflict, since guardians won't dispute about ownership or boundaries. But Aristotle argues this ignores human psychology and motivation. People take better care of what's their own than what's communal. We've all experienced this. Shared spaces often fall into disrepair because no one feels personally responsible. Property held in common receives minimal care from maximum people. Private property, in contrast, motivates care and improvement. A farmer who owns his land has strong incentive to improve it, benefiting not just himself but society. Private ownership also enables certain virtues that communal ownership makes impossible. You can't practice generosity without private property. Generosity means giving what's yours to help others. The same applies to hospitality and helping friends in need. Furthermore, most disputes don't arise from private property, but from injustice and base character. People quarrel because they're unjust or greedy, not because property is private. Communal property won't eliminate these problems and might worsen them by creating new sources of conflict over who does how much work and who takes how much benefit. The critique of communal families is even more pointed. Plato proposes that guardian children should be raised collectively, with no one knowing their biological parents or children. This would supposedly make all guardians regard all children as their children, caring for every child as their own and extending family feeling throughout the guardian class. Aristotle argues this would actually dilute family bonds rather than extend them.
Love and care are naturally particular, directed towards specific individuals we know and have relationships with. A father loves his own son intensely and particularly. If you try to make him love all children equally as his, you don't extend that intense love to everyone. You dilute it into weak, generalized benevolence. When everyone is your son, no one is really your son. The bond becomes watered down like wine mixed with too much water. Moreover, the scheme is practically unworkable. Despite efforts to obscure parentage, people would figure out relationships through family resemblances, timing of births, and natural affections. The plan would create confusion and unintended problems, like the risk of inadvertent incest if children don't know who their siblings are. It would also eliminate the special education that comes from the parent-child relationship, where parents invest deeply in their children's character formation. What makes people care deeply about something is that it's peculiarly their own, their responsibility, their concern. When responsibility is diffused across everyone, motivation weakens. Everyone's responsibility becomes no one's responsibility. Aristotle also examines Plato's later work of the Laws, which presents a more moderate, realistic constitutional proposal. The Laws allows private property and families, regulates rather than eliminates private life, and describes institutions in greater detail. This suggests Plato himself recognized problems with the Republic's more radical proposals. However, the Laws is ambiguous about key questions, falling somewhere between the ideal city of the Republic and existing Greek constitutions, without clearly defining where. It's extremely detailed about minor matters like regulations governing drinking parties, while leaving crucial issues like property distribution and constitutional structure vague or unresolved. Aristotle also examines proposals from other philosophers. Phaleas of Chalcedon suggested that equal distribution of property would eliminate civil conflict. If everyone has the same amount, no one would envy others or revolt against inequality. Aristotle responds that this misidentifies the source of political conflict. Some conflict stems from need, but much arises from desires beyond basic needs: honor, recognition, power, revenge. Equal property distribution wouldn't eliminate ambition, rivalry, or ideological disagreement.
Moreover, even establishing equal property at some starting point wouldn't maintain it. People have different numbers of children, work with different skill and luck, and over time, inequality would reemerge unless the state constantly redistributed, creating its own problems. Hippodamus of Miletus proposed dividing citizens into three classes: soldiers, farmers, and artisans, with land divided into sacred, public, and private. Aristotle raises several objections about how artisans fit without land, who makes military decisions, and how elements of democracy, oligarchy, and aristocracy would work together coherently. Aristotle then turns from theoretical proposals to actual constitutions admired for excellence, beginning with Sparta. Sparta was legendary for its military prowess, social discipline, and constitutional stability, maintaining essentially the same political system for centuries, while other Greek cities experienced constant revolution. Many Greeks looked to Sparta as a model of political excellence, but Aristotle's analysis is deeply critical. He admires some aspects. Sparta's constitution achieves mixed government, combining monarchy through 2 kings, aristocracy through the Council of Elders, and democracy through the ephors elected annually. This mixture creates checks and balances, contributing to stability. The regime succeeds in making citizens willing to accept the constitution without constantly seeking to overthrow it. Spartan education is also noteworthy, taking education seriously as a public concern, with rigorous training from age 7 designed to develop courage, endurance, discipline, and loyalty. However, the problems with Sparta are severe. First, the Spartan system focuses too exclusively on military virtue. The whole society is organized around producing superior soldiers, appropriate when facing external threats, but insufficient for the good life. Once Sparta achieved military dominance, Spartans didn't know how to live well in peace. They're like athletes who train obsessively for competition, but don't know what to do when not competing. War virtues, courage, endurance, and discipline are important but subordinate to virtues like
wisdom, justice, and philosophical contemplation that constitute the truly good life. Second, the Spartan economic system is fundamentally flawed and unstable. Full citizens, the Spartiates, don't work, but are professional soldiers supported by helots, state-owned slaves who vastly outnumber them and constantly threaten revolt. This breeds both fear and brutality, with secret police conducting periodic terror campaigns. Meanwhile, landholding became increasingly concentrated despite original equal distribution. The law allowed giving away or bequeathing land to daughters, and gradually much accumulated in women's hands. As some citizens lost their land, they lost citizenship, since citizenship required contributing to common meals. This created a shrinking citizen body that weakened Sparta's military power.
Third, key Spartan institutions have serious defects. The ephors, 5 officials elected annually with enormous power, are drawn from all citizens without regard to merit, meaning highest offices often go to poor men easily corrupted by bribes. The Council of Elders holds office for life after age 60, judging important cases but often taking bribes, with no accountability if they become corrupt or senile. Most fundamentally, Sparta's entire system aims at making citizens excellent in one narrow respect: military courage and discipline. This would be appropriate if the purpose of political community were simply military security. But as Aristotle established in Book 1, the purpose is the good life, the full development of human excellence. Military security is necessary, but not sufficient for flourishing. Aristotle examines Crete more briefly, as Spartan constitutions supposedly derived from Cretan models. Cretan constitutions share many features with Sparta: common meals, serfs working the land, mixed government, but face even more severe problems with civil conflict. The island divides among multiple cities, warring with each other, and Cretan officials corresponding to Sparta's ephors are even more prone to corruption and factionalism, sometimes engaging in open revolt. Carthage, the great Phoenician city in North Africa, had a constitution Aristotle considers best among existing regimes he examines. Like Sparta, Carthage mixes monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements through suffetes, council of elders, and popular assemblies. What makes Carthage superior to Sparta is its more balanced approach. Carthage isn't organized exclusively around military virtue, but is a commercial power valuing economic success alongside military strength. Its citizens can pursue various forms of excellence, not just warfare. However, Carthage also has significant flaws. Most problematically, it allows wealth to influence political office excessively. While offices require merit, they also require wealth, meaning the constitution contains both aristocratic and oligarchic elements, ruled by the virtuous and ruled by the wealthy. These can conflict since virtue and wealth don't necessarily coincide. Some wealthy citizens lack virtue, while some virtuous citizens lack wealth. A constitution requiring both will sometimes exclude the virtuous poor, while including the wealthy but base.
The system also concentrates too much power in small boards, where factionalism and corruption can more easily take hold than in larger bodies, where diverse interests provide checks. What should we take from Aristotle's extensive critical examination? Several important lessons emerge. Theoretical elegance doesn't guarantee practical workability. Plato's proposals are philosophically compelling in some respects, but founder on practical realities of human nature. A constitution must work for real human beings as they actually are. Excessive unity is dangerous for a political community. A city needs diversity of talents, perspectives, and roles. The goal should be harmony among different elements, not homogeneity. This has profound implications for political movements that aim at maximum unity through nationalism, ideology, or cultural conformity. Aristotle suggests pluralism within a shared constitutional framework is healthier than enforced sameness. Economic arrangements profoundly affect political stability and justice. Sparta's flawed landholding contributed to its decline, while Carthage's wealth requirement creates tensions. Any viable constitution must address property, wealth distribution, and economic opportunity as central concerns. Military excellence alone is insufficient for political excellence, as Sparta demonstrates dramatically. The best constitution cultivates all virtues and enables citizens to live well in peace as well as war. Mixed constitutions balancing different elements and interests tend toward greater stability than unmixed regimes, though the mixture must be carefully designed for particular circumstances. We should learn from both successes and failures of existing regimes rather than reasoning about politics purely abstractly. Aristotle's empirical approach examines what has actually worked or failed, preventing utopianism that proposes beautiful theories unconnected to political realities. Book 2 exemplifies Aristotle's philosophical method at its best. Rigorous critical analysis, empirical evidence, learning from predecessors while correcting errors, and maintaining practical wisdom alongside theoretical understanding. With this critical groundwork laid, Aristotle is prepared to develop his own positive account of constitutional excellence in Book 3.
Having criticized alternative constitutional theories and existing regimes in Book 2, Aristotle turns in Book 3 to fundamental questions about the nature of political community itself. Before we can understand what makes a constitution good or bad, we need to answer more basic questions. What is a citizen? What is a constitution? What makes a constitution legitimate? How should we classify different constitutional forms? Book 3 addresses these foundational issues with Aristotle's characteristic philosophical rigor, combining conceptual analysis with attention to practical political realities. Aristotle begins with the question of citizenship, which proves more complicated than it initially appears. Who counts as a citizen? The obvious answer might seem to be anyone who lives in a city. But this won't work. Resident aliens live in the city but aren't citizens. Slaves live there but aren't citizens. Children live there but aren't citizens in the full sense. So, what distinguishes citizens from mere residents? Aristotle proposes that a citizen in the strict sense is someone who shares in deliberative and judicial office. Citizens participate in making decisions about the community's direction and in judging disputes according to law. This isn't about holding high office necessarily. Even ordinary citizens in a democracy participate in the assembly that makes laws and in juries that judge cases. This participatory role distinguishes citizens from subjects who simply obey laws without participating in making them. However, this definition immediately raises problems. Different constitutions define citizenship differently. In a democracy, many people count as citizens who wouldn't in an oligarchy or aristocracy. A port craftsman might be a full citizen in democratic Athens, but excluded from citizenship in oligarchic Sparta or aristocratic regimes that restrict citizenship to the wealthy or well-born. Does this mean citizenship has no fixed definition? Is it purely relative to each constitution? Aristotle acknowledges the difficulty, but insists we can distinguish between citizenship in an unqualified sense and citizenship in particular regimes.
A good citizen, in the fullest sense, is someone capable of ruling and being ruled well, possessing the virtue and practical wisdom needed to participate excellently in political life. But many constitutions grant citizenship to people who lack these qualities. They're citizens in their particular regime, but not good citizens in the unqualified sense.
This leads to a crucial distinction between the good citizen and the good person. Are they the same? In one sense, no. A good citizen is someone who contributes to preserving and improving their particular constitution. But different constitutions require different virtues from citizens. A good citizen in a democracy might need different qualities than a good citizen in an oligarchy. The virtues that make someone an excellent participant in democratic deliberation might differ from those needed in aristocratic governance. Moreover, not every citizen needs the complete virtue of a good person. In a well-ordered city, different citizens have different rules. Some rule, others are ruled. Some engage in manual labor, others in deliberation. The shoemaker can be a good citizen by making shoes excellently and obeying laws, even if he doesn't possess philosophical wisdom. However, in the best constitution, the good citizen and good person do coincide, at least for those who rule. A truly excellent regime aims at developing complete human virtue in its citizens, not just the particular skills needed for their social role. And those who govern must possess genuine practical wisdom and moral virtue. They must be good persons in the fullest sense to rule well. This is an important aspiration, even if fully realized only in ideal conditions. Aristotle then addresses puzzles about the identity of the city and constitution over time. When we say Athens is the same city across decades or centuries, what makes it the same? Is it territory? But cities sometimes change borders. Is it the people? But the population constantly changes as people are born and die. Aristotle argues that the constitution is what gives the city its identity. Athens is Athens because of its constitutional structure, the way it organizes political authority and citizenship. When the constitution changes fundamentally, say from democracy to oligarchy, it becomes, in an important sense, a different city, even though the people and territory remain largely the same. This explains why regime change sometimes involves repudiating debts from the previous regime. The new regime can claim to be a different city that doesn't inherit all obligations of its predecessor. This raises the question of what obligations persist across regime change. Should a new regime honor treaties or debts from a previous regime if it is overthrown? Aristotle's answer is nuanced. If the previous regime acted justly and for the common good, there's moral reason to honor its commitments. If it was a tyranny, ruling for private benefit, the new regime has less obligation to honor agreements made by tyrants for tyrannical purposes. The key is whether the previous regime was acting as a legitimate political community, serving common interests, or merely as a criminal enterprise, exploiting the population.
Having clarified citizenship and constitutional identity, Aristotle turns to classifying constitutional forms. This becomes the most famous and influential part of Book 3. Aristotle identifies 6 basic constitutional types arranged in a systematic classification. The classification depends on 2 questions. First, who rules? One person, few people, or many people? Second, does the regime aim at the common good or the private interest of the rulers? Combining these dimensions yields 6 types. When one person rules for the common good, this is kingship or monarchy. The king rules like a good father, using authority for the benefit of all. Kingship works best when one individual so surpasses others in virtue and ability that his rule serves everyone better than any alternative arrangement. When one person rules for private interest, this is tyranny. The tyrant rules like a master over slaves, exploiting the city for personal benefit. Tyranny is the worst constitution because it treats free citizens as slaves and perverts political authority into despotic domination. When a few rule for the common good, this is aristocracy, rule by the best. Aristocracies select rulers based on virtue and ability, giving political power to those most capable of governing wisely for everyone's benefit. When a few rule for their private interest, this is oligarchy, rule by the wealthy. Oligarchies give power to the rich who govern to benefit themselves at others' expense. The wealthy use political power to protect and increase their wealth, extracting resources from the poor. When the many rule for the common good, this is polity, or constitutional government. The many govern through law and institution, checking their own tendencies toward short-sighted self-interest and maintaining constitutional order that benefits all. When the many rule for their private interest, this is democracy in its deviant form. The poor majority use political power to benefit themselves at the wealthy's expense, redistributing property and making decisions based on immediate interests rather than justice or the common good. This classification is both elegant and profound. It structures political analysis in ways that remain influential. But Aristotle immediately complicates it with important observations. First, the distinction between few and many, in practice, usually maps onto the distinction between rich and poor. Oligarchy is typically ruled by the wealthy few. Democracy is typically ruled by the poor many. These aren't just numerical differences, but class differences. Political conflict usually centers on struggles between rich and poor over how resources and power should be distributed. Second, the line between correct and deviant forms isn't always sharp in practice. Actual regimes fall on a spectrum. Some democracies have strongly demagogic tendencies toward mob rule, but also maintain constitutional restraints. Some oligarchies benefit mainly the wealthy, but also provide some common goods. Real political communities are messy, mixing elements of different types.
Third, the classification raises a fundamental question about political justice. Oligarchs argue that justice means giving more to those who contribute more, and the wealthy contribute more property and resources to the city. Therefore, justice requires giving them more political power. Democrats argue that justice means equality among free citizens, and all free persons are equally free. Therefore, justice requires equal political power in a democracy. Aristocrats argue that justice means giving power to the most virtuous, since only the virtuous can rule well. Therefore, justice requires aristocracy. Who is right? Aristotle argues they're each partially correct, but make the same error, taking a part of justice for the whole. Justice does involve proportional distribution based on contribution. Those who contribute more do deserve more in some respects. Justice also involves equality among equals. Free persons do deserve equal treatment in certain respects. Justice also involves recognizing and rewarding virtue. The virtuous do deserve honor and authority. The error comes from absolutizing one principle while ignoring others. Political justice must be more complex and multifaceted. Different principles of distribution apply in different contexts and for different goods. Moreover, the ultimate purpose of political community isn't merely protecting property, maintaining freedom, or even rewarding virtue in isolation. It's enabling the good life, the full development of human excellence. This telos must guide our thinking about justice. Constitutional arrangements should be evaluated by how well they serve this end. A legitimate constitution is one that genuinely serves the common good, understood as enabling all citizens to live well and develop their capacities.
This doesn't mean everyone must benefit equally or in the same way. Different citizens make different contributions and receive different benefits. But the overall structure must aim at common benefit, not exploit some for others' advantage. Aristotle then addresses the controversial question of whether kingship can ever be justified. In most Greek cities, monarchy was viewed with suspicion or hostility. Greeks valued political participation and feared tyranny. But Aristotle argues that in certain circumstances, kingship might be the best constitution. If one individual genuinely surpasses all others so greatly in virtue and political ability that his wisdom exceeds what any group could achieve through collective deliberation, then giving him absolute authority might serve the common good best. Such a person would be like a god among humans. It would be wrong to insist he take turns ruling or submit to laws made by inferiors. However, Aristotle immediately acknowledges how rare such circumstances would be. Such extraordinary individuals almost never exist. Claims about exceptional virtue are usually pretexts for tyranny. Moreover, even if such a person existed, making them absolute ruler creates dangerous precedents and corrupts political life by replacing participation and deliberation with submission to authority. In practice, therefore, kingship is rarely justified. Constitutional government with laws and institutions checking power serves better in nearly all circumstances.
What about the rule of law versus the rule of men? Should the best persons rule, or should law rule? This ancient question remains central to political philosophy. Those who favor rule by the best persons argue that law is too rigid and general. Every situation has unique features requiring judgment and adaptation. Law necessarily speaks in universals, but governance requires responding to particulars. The wise ruler can see what the situation requires and act accordingly, while law blindly applies general rules regardless of context. Moreover, law can't anticipate every circumstance. New situations arise that no law addresses. Wise rulers can respond, while legal systems merely generate confusion when cases fall outside existing rules. Aristotle has some sympathy for these arguments, but ultimately sides with the rule of law, with important qualifications. Law represents reason without appetite. Even the best human rulers have emotions, interests, and biases that can cloud judgment. Law embodies the collective wisdom of the community refined over time, not just one person's views at one moment. Legal rule creates predictability and stability. Citizens know in advance what's required and prohibited. This is impossible when rulers make arbitrary decisions. Legal systems can incorporate mechanisms for adaptation, procedures for amending laws, principles for interpreting them in new contexts, and institutions for applying general rules to particular cases. So law needn't be as rigid as critics suggest. However, if Aristotle acknowledges that law alone is insufficient. Laws require good lawmakers to create them and good judges and magistrates to apply them wisely. The rule of law works best when combined with rule by virtuous persons working within legal frameworks. Law channels and checks human judgment, while human judgment interprets and applies law intelligently. Book 3 concludes by emphasizing that constitutional questions are fundamentally ethical questions. We can't determine the best constitution without understanding the best life. Political arrangements should be evaluated by whether they enable human flourishing. This means constitutional theory requires philosophical reflection on virtue, happiness, justice, and the good life. Aristotle has now established the conceptual foundations needed to address these questions directly. Who should rule? What is justice? What constitutional form best serves the human good?
Book 4 will begin developing Aristotle's positive answers, but Book 3 has clarified what questions we must answer and how to think about them philosophically. The good constitution is one that enables citizens to live well, developing their distinctive human capacities in community with others under just laws that serve the common good, rather than private interests. This is the standard by which all actual constitutions must be judged.
Having established the conceptual framework for understanding constitutions in Book 3, Aristotle turns in Book 4 to a more practical and empirical analysis of constitutional varieties. If Book 3 asked what a constitution is in principle, Book 4 asks what constitutions actually exist and how they function in practice. This book represents Aristotle at his most empirical and pragmatic, analyzing real political arrangements rather than ideal forms. He's less concerned here with the absolutely best constitution than with what works well under actual conditions most cities face. Aristotle begins by explaining why political science must study not just the best constitution, but multiple constitutional forms. Some critics might object that political philosophy should focus exclusively on the ideal. Why waste time on second-best or third-best arrangements? Aristotle offers several compelling reasons. First, the best constitution, in the absolute sense, requires conditions that rarely exist. It needs citizens with exceptional virtue, adequate wealth, favorable territory, and other circumstances few cities possess. A political science that spoke only about ideal conditions would be useless for most actual cities. We need guidance for how to govern well under less than ideal circumstances. Second, even if we know the absolutely best constitution, different cities need different arrangements based on their particular circumstances, history, and population. What works for one city might fail in another. Political science must understand this variety and provide guidance suited to different situations. Third, we need to understand how to preserve existing constitutions, even imperfect ones. A city with an oligarchic or democratic constitution doesn't necessarily want to transform into something radically different. They want to know how to make their existing system work better and last longer. Fourth, we need to understand how constitutions decay and how to prevent it. This requires studying not just good constitutions, but also bad ones, and understanding what makes them unstable. Aristotle's approach here is thoroughly empirical. He and his students had collected and studied constitutions from 158 different Greek city-states. This massive research project, one of the first systematic comparative political studies, informs Book 4's analysis. Aristotle examines patterns across many cases, identifying what features correlate with stability or instability, justice or injustice, good governance or dysfunction. This is political science in a genuinely scientific sense, not just philosophical speculation, but systematic investigation of political phenomena.
Aristotle begins by noting that the sixfold classification from Book 3, while useful, is too simple for actual political analysis. Real constitutions don't fall neatly into 6 types. Instead, each basic type has multiple varieties, and most actual constitutions mix elements from different types. Consider democracy. Aristotle identifies several distinct varieties based on which class dominates and how institutions are structured. In one variety, offices have significant property qualifications, but these are low enough that many citizens, including craftsmen and traders, can meet them. In another variety, all free-born citizens participate regardless of property. In another, all residents participate, not just those of citizen birth. In extreme democracy, the assembled people override law itself, governed by demagogues rather than constitutional rules. These are all democracies in the sense that the many rule, but they function very differently and have different characters. Similarly with oligarchy. Some oligarchies have moderately high property qualifications that include the middle class along with the wealthy. Others restrict office to a tiny, wealthy elite. Some oligarchies fill office by election, others by heredity or co-optation, where current office holders choose their successors. Some maintain strong rule of law, while others allow the wealthy to govern arbitrarily. These variations produce fundamentally different political experiences even within the same constitutional type. The variety exists because cities differ in social composition. Some have large middle classes. Others have stark divisions between very rich and very poor. Some have predominantly agricultural economies, others commercial or maritime economies. Some have diverse populations, others relative homogeneity. These differences in social structure produce different political possibilities and pressures. Aristotle pays particular attention to the middle class and introduces one of his most important political insights. The best practical constitution for most cities is what he calls polity, a mixed constitution that gives significant power to the middle class. Why is the middle class so important? Aristotle offers several arguments rooted in his understanding of virtue and the mean. The middle class occupies the mean between extreme wealth and extreme poverty. This gives them practical advantages. They're wealthy enough to have leisure for political participation and education, but not so wealthy that they become arrogant and detached from common concerns. They're poor enough to understand ordinary citizens' needs and vulnerabilities, but not so poor that they're desperate or easily corrupted. The middle class is least prone to factional conflict. The very wealthy desire to dominate others and view themselves as naturally superior. The very poor often envy the rich and support radical redistribution. The middle class, having moderate property and comfortable but not luxurious lives, are more satisfied with their situation and more committed to stability. They're neither potential tyrants nor potential revolutionaries.
Moreover, the middle class is most capable of ruling and being ruled in turn, which Aristotle identified in Book 3 as the mark of good citizenship. The wealthy often resist being ruled by others, viewing themselves as above common citizens. The poor often lack the resources, education, and confidence for effective rule. The middle class can both exercise authority responsibly and accept others' authority when appropriate. Cities with large middle classes tend toward stability and moderation. When the middle class is numerous and strong, it can balance between rich and poor, preventing either extreme from dominating. Such cities avoid the destructive factional conflicts that plague cities divided into hostile camps of wealthy and poor with no mediating force. In contrast, cities with small middle classes, where most people are either very rich or very poor, tend toward instability, oscillating between oligarchy and extreme democracy as each faction seizes power and exploits the other. Aristotle's prescription, therefore, is that lawmakers should aim to strengthen the middle class and give them significant political power. This doesn't mean excluding the rich or poor from participation, but ensuring the middle class forms the core of the citizen body and holds the balance of power. How can this be achieved? Through laws regulating property distribution to prevent extreme concentration of wealth. Through economic policies that enable citizens to acquire moderate property. Through education that develops the judgment and virtue needed for middle-class citizenship. And through constitutional arrangements that give the middle class weight in decision-making. The polity, or mixed constitution, achieved this by blending elements from democracy and oligarchy in ways that create balance. Some offices might have property qualifications, while others are open to all citizens. Some decisions might require approval from both a property qualified council and a popular assembly. Election to some offices might be by lot,
characteristic of democracy, while election to others might be by vote, allowing the wealthy and educated to exercise influence. Military service requirements might vary by wealth class, but with both wealthy and poor serving in different capacities. The goal is not mathematical precision, but practical balance that gives all major groups stake in the Constitution while preventing any one group from dominating.
Aristotle emphasizes that the specific institutional design must fit the particular city. There's no one-size-fits-all formula. A city with a very large class of poor farmers needs different arrangements than a city with numerous wealthy merchants. A maritime commercial city faces different challenges than an inland agricultural one. The lawmaker must understand the city's social structure, economy, history, and culture, then design institutions that work for that particular population. This requires political wisdom and practical judgment, not just theoretical knowledge. Aristotle then addresses how to preserve different constitutional forms. Even if we prefer a polity with a strong middle class, many cities have oligarchic or democratic constitutions that won't radically transform. These cities need advice for maintaining stability and governing justly within their existing systems. For oligarchies, Aristotle advises moderation. Oligarchies fail most often because the wealthy govern too exclusively for their own benefit, oppressing the poor and provoking revolution. A wise oligarchy should include some poor citizens in minor offices, treat the poor justly in courts, and avoid conspicuous luxury that inflames resentment. It should maintain strong rule of law so the wealthy can't act arbitrarily. It should provide public services and economic opportunities that benefit all citizens, not just the elite. An oligarchy that governs for the common good and treats non-oligarchs fairly can achieve stability. For democracies, Aristotle similarly counsels moderation. Democracies fail when the poor majority uses its power to confiscate wealth and oppress the rich, driving the wealthy to conspire against the regime. A wise democracy should protect property rights and avoid extreme redistribution. It should select capable officials, not just any random citizen. It should maintain constitutional restraints on popular power rather than allowing the assembled people to override law based on momentary passion. It should cultivate respect for law and tradition, not treating everything as subject to popular whim. A democracy that respects law, protects property, and governs for the common good rather than simply for the poor's immediate interests can be stable and just. The pattern is clear. Constitutional stability requires moderation, respect for law, and genuine concern for the common good, rather than narrow factional interest. Whether oligarchy, democracy, or mixed constitution, regimes that govern justly for all citizens and avoid oppressing any major group tend toward stability. Regimes that exploit one class for another's benefit tend toward revolution. This seems almost obvious, yet Aristotle notes how often cities ignore it, with ruling groups pursuing short-term advantage that provokes their own overthrow.
Aristotle also analyzes the causes of constitutional change and revolution. Understanding why constitutions fall helps us prevent it. Revolutions have both general causes and specific triggers. The general cause is injustice and inequality, particularly when the ruled feel oppressed or excluded unfairly. When one class dominates and exploits others, resentment builds until some spark ignites revolution. Specific triggers vary. Sometimes it's personal insults to leading citizens, who then become revolution leaders. Sometimes it's fear among the wealthy that the poor will confiscate their property, or fear among the poor that the rich will enslave them. Sometimes small constitutional changes accumulate until the regime's character transforms entirely. Sometimes external enemies exploit internal divisions. Sometimes a particularly incompetent or tyrannical leader provokes rebellion. Often multiple factors combine. Different constitutional forms face different typical dangers. Democracies often fall to demagogues who rise to power by flattering the masses and attacking the wealthy, then establish tyrannies once they've gained authority. Oligarchies often fall when the oligarchs fight among themselves for power and wealth, dividing the ruling class, or when they oppress the poor so severely that revolution becomes preferable to continued submission. Aristocracies fall when they become too exclusive, failing to include capable citizens who don't meet narrow criteria, creating a class of talented but excluded individuals who lead opposition. Tyrannies fall in various ways: through conspiracies among those close to the tyrant, through popular uprising when oppression becomes unbearable, through foreign intervention, or through internal weakness as tyrannical families decay across generations.
The remedies correspond to the causes. To prevent revolution, govern justly and for the common good. Include all major groups in the Constitution somehow, even if not equally. Maintain strong rule of law that constrains the powerful. Avoid extreme inequality that creates desperate poverty and arrogant wealth. Educate citizens to value the Constitution and understand their responsibilities. Select officials based on competence and virtue, not just wealth or birth or popularity. Respond to grievances before they explode into revolution. Watch for signs of instability and address causes early. Maintain military forces loyal to the Constitution, not to particular individuals or factions. These are not exotic secrets, but applications of practical wisdom to political life. Aristotle concludes Book 4 by emphasizing that different cities need different institutions, even within the same general constitutional type. Two democracies might require quite different specific arrangements because their populations differ. The task of the legislator is like that of the craftsman, who must adapt general principles to particular materials and purposes. A shipbuilder knows general principles of shipbuilding, but each ship must be designed for its particular purpose and conditions. A warship differs from a merchant vessel. A ship for calm waters differs from one for rough seas. Similarly, the political craftsman must understand general principles of constitutional design, but apply them intelligently to particular circumstances. This requires both theoretical knowledge and practical experience, both understanding of principles and judgment about particulars. The best political science combines both dimensions, which is exactly what Aristotle attempts to provide. Book 4 thus represents political philosophy at its most practical and empirical, offering guidance for real political actors facing actual conditions rather than merely theorizing about ideal arrangements. Yet it remains thoroughly philosophical, grounded in Aristotle's understanding of human nature, virtue, justice, and the purpose of political community. This combination of empirical analysis and philosophical depth makes it enduringly valuable for understanding politics.
Having examined the varieties of constitutions and how they should be structured in Book 4, Aristotle dedicates Book 5 entirely to the problem of constitutional change and revolution. This book represents one of the earliest systematic studies of revolution, analyzing why regimes fall and how they can be preserved. Aristotle approaches revolution not as a moral problem primarily, though he certainly has moral concerns, but as a political phenomenon to be understood empirically. He examines actual cases of constitutional collapse and regime change, identifying patterns and causes. The goal is eminently practical, to help legislators and statesmen understand the forces that destabilize regimes so they can prevent revolution, or, when holding power after revolution, establish more stable arrangements. Aristotle begins with the general principle that revolutions occur when political arrangements violate citizens' sense of justice. Different groups have different conceptions of justice, as we saw in Book 3. Democrats believe justice means equality among free citizens. Oligarchs believe justice means proportional distribution based on wealth and contribution. Aristocrats believe justice means rule by the virtuous. When a constitution embodies one conception while excluding or oppressing those who hold another, tension builds toward revolution. The key insight is that revolution stems not simply from objective injustice, but from perceived injustice.
People revolt when they feel treated unfairly, according to their understanding of what they deserve. Even if we disagree with their conception of justice, we must understand that it motivates their actions. A regime might seem perfectly just to its beneficiaries while appearing deeply unjust to those excluded or disadvantaged. This explains why the same constitutional form can be stable in one city, but unstable in another. If most citizens accept the prevailing conception of justice embodied in the Constitution, the regime will be stable. If significant groups reject it as unjust, instability follows. Therefore, preserving a constitution requires either ensuring it genuinely serves the common good in ways all major groups can accept, or ensuring that those who might revolt lack the power and opportunity to do so. The first is obviously morally preferable, but Aristotle analyzes both strategies since rulers often pursue the second. Aristotle then examines specific causes of evolution in different constitutional types, beginning with democracy. Democracies most commonly fall because of demagogues. These are leaders who rise to power by flattering the masses and attacking the wealthy. They promise the poor greater equality, redistribution of property, and revenge against the rich. The people attracted by these promises give demagogues increasing power. Once established in authority, demagogues often become tyrants, using the power granted by the people to establish personal rule. This pattern repeated throughout Greek history. A democracy troubled by conflict between rich and poor turns to a charismatic leader who claims to champion the people. That leader uses popular support to attack the wealthy, confiscate property, and eliminate rivals. Eventually, he transforms democracy into tyranny, ruling as a personal dictator rather than as the people's representative.
How can democracies prevent this? By avoiding extreme measures against the wealthy that create desperate enemies willing to support any alternative. By maintaining constitutional restraints on popular leaders rather than granting unlimited authority to individuals. By educating citizens to recognize demagogic manipulation. And by ensuring that leadership positions rotate and are checked by institutions rather than concentrated in single individuals. Democracies also fall when they become too extreme and unstable. If the assembled people constantly change laws based on momentary passions, override legal protections, and confiscate property arbitrarily, even democratic citizens lose faith in the system. The wealthy will conspire against such a regime, but moderate Democrats may also support constitutional change towards something more stable and lawful. A democracy that respects law, protects basic property rights, and governs predictably is far more stable than one where everything depends on the current mood of the assembled crowd. Oligarchies face different typical dangers. They often fall because of conflicts among the oligarchs themselves. When the ruling class fights over power and wealth, they weaken themselves and create opportunities for the excluded to revolt. Oligarchic families compete for dominance, form factions, and sometimes seek popular support against rival oligarchs, inadvertently empowering the demos. Oligarchies also fall when they oppress the poor too severely. If the oligarchs extract too much wealth, provide too little justice, and display too much arrogant luxury while the poor suffer, eventually the poor will revolt if they see any opportunity. The oppression creates such resentment that even risky rebellion seems preferable to continued submission. Additionally, oligarchies sometimes fall when they exclude capable but moderately wealthy citizens from power. If the oligarchy is very narrow, restricted to only the wealthiest few, it creates a class of citizens who are wealthy enough to have resources and ambition, but excluded from political participation. These excluded notables often become revolution leaders rallying the poor against the ruling oligarchy.
Wise oligarchies can prevent these dangers through several strategies. They should avoid excessive oppression of the poor, governing with some concern for common welfare rather than pure exploitation. They should maintain justice in courts so the poor have legal recourse rather than needing revolution. They should include moderately wealthy citizens in government rather than restricting power to a tiny elite. They should avoid conspicuous displays of luxury that inflame resentment.
They should resolve disputes among themselves through established procedures rather than factional warfare. And they should maintain loyalty among those who serve the regime militarily and administratively by treating them fairly. An oligarchy that governs moderately, maintains internal unity, and doesn't push the excluded to desperation can achieve stability despite ruling for the few. Aristocracies face dangers similar to oligarchies with additional complications. Aristocracies claim to rule based on virtue rather than wealth. But in practice, the virtuous are often also wealthy, and the boundaries blur. Aristocracies fall when the criteria for inclusion become too narrow or rigid. If only those meeting very specific requirements of birth, education, and virtue can participate, capable citizens who don't quite meet these standards become frustrated. They feel unjustly excluded despite having genuine merit. Such excluded but capable individuals often lead movements to broaden the constitution toward polity or democracy. Aristocracies also fall when those in power fail to live up to aristocratic ideals. If the supposed best citizens govern corruptly, pursue personal gain, and lack the virtue they claim, they lose legitimacy. People conclude that if these are the best, aristocracy is a fraud and support constitutional change. Maintaining aristocracy requires both breadth enough to include all genuinely capable citizens and high enough standards that rulers actually display superior virtue and govern for the common good.
Aristotle gives special attention to tyranny, the worst and most unstable constitutional form. Tyrannies arise in several ways. Sometimes democracies elevate demagogues who become tyrants. Sometimes oligarchies concentrate power in one individual to resolve factional conflicts. Sometimes military commanders use their armies to seize power. Sometimes foreign powers install tyrants to control conquered cities. Once established, tyrants face constant danger. They rule without legitimacy or consent, maintaining power through fear, force, and manipulation. Almost everyone has reason to hate them. The poor because tyrants oppress them. The wealthy because tyrants confiscate their property. The capable because tyrants fear and eliminate potential rivals. Tyrannies fall through conspiracies among those close to the tyrant, through popular uprisings when repression fails, through foreign intervention, through assassination, or through gradual decay as tyrannical families weaken across generations. Tyrants employ various strategies to maintain power. They eliminate potential leaders who might organize opposition by killing, exiling, or humiliating prominent citizens. They impoverish the population so people are too busy surviving to plot rebellion. They prohibit common meals, clubs, and education that might create organized groups. They employ spies to monitor subjects and create atmosphere of suspicion where no one trusts anyone. They start wars to keep people focused on external enemies and dependent on the tyrant's military leadership. They promote the lowborn to important positions, creating officials who owe everything to the tyrant and have no independent power base. They tax heavily to extract wealth while distributing some to supporters to maintain a base of beneficiaries. They appear religious and pious to gain traditional legitimacy. These strategies can prolong tyranny, but rarely indefinitely, since they create such universal resentment that eventually someone finds opportunity for a successful revolt. Some tyrants attempt a different strategy, governing more moderately to make their rule more bearable and stable. They maintain outward appearance of constitutional rule while holding ultimate power. They appear to govern for the common good while actually maintaining personal domination. They cultivate reputation for virtue and wisdom. They avoid excessive cruelty and confiscation. They maintain justice in minor matters while controlling major decisions. They honor capable citizens with positions that carry prestige but not real power. This moderate tyranny can last longer than openly brutal rule. But Aristotle notes it remains fundamentally unjust and unstable because it rests on deception rather than genuine consent and constitutional legitimacy.
Throughout these analyses, Aristotle provides numerous historical examples from Greek city-states. He describes specific revolutions, identifying what triggered them and how they unfolded. In one city, a revolution began when a wealthy citizen was publicly insulted by a magistrate and sought revenge by organizing opposition. In another, gradual changes in voting procedures accumulated until the constitution's character transformed entirely from oligarchy to democracy without anyone explicitly deciding to change regimes. In another, a military commander used his army's loyalty to seize power after the city split into hostile factions. These concrete cases illustrate Aristotle's general principles and demonstrate that he's not theorizing abstractly, but analyzing actual political experience. What general lessons emerge from Book 5? First, constitutional stability requires justice and moderation. Regimes that genuinely serve the common good and treat all major groups fairly tend toward stability. Those that exploit some for others' benefit breed resentment and revolution. Second, wise legislators and statesmen must attend to citizens' sense of justice, not just objective conditions. People revolt based on how they perceive their treatment, not just on material conditions. A regime must seem legitimate to be stable. Third, internal unity among the ruling class is crucial for stability. Whether democracy, oligarchy, or aristocracy, regimes weaken fatally when the ruling group divides into hostile factions. Fourth, constitutional change often happens gradually, through accumulation of small modifications rather than sudden dramatic revolution. Wise statesmen watch for incremental changes that might transform the regime's character over time. Fifth, external threats can both stabilize and destabilize regimes. A common enemy often unifies a city and strengthens regime loyalty, but defeat in war frequently triggers revolution as citizens blame the regime for disaster. Sixth, individuals matter enormously in political stability. A single demagogue can transform a democracy into tyranny. A single wise leader can prevent revolution through timely reforms. Political prudence in specific situations shapes outcomes as much as general institutional structures. Seventh, prevention is far easier than cure. Addressing grievances early, maintaining justice, and governing moderately prevents revolutions that become unstoppable once they gain momentum. Waiting until crisis erupts makes preservation nearly impossible.
Finally, there is fundamental tension between stability and justice. The most stable arrangements are often not the most just, while the most just arrangements may face resistance from those who benefit from injustice. An oligarchy might achieve stability by moderating its oppression just enough to prevent revolt while still exploiting the poor. This is stable but unjust. A radical democracy might justly seek to overcome entrenched oligarchic power, but create instability through conflict with the wealthy. The best practical solution is the mixed constitution with strong middle class that Aristotle advocated in Book 4. Such a regime can be both relatively just, giving all major groups representation and stake in the constitution, and relatively stable, balancing interests so no group has overwhelming grievance or power to overturn the system. Book 5 thus provides a handbook for statesmen facing the perennial problem of maintaining political order while governing justly. Aristotle offers no simple formulas, but rather develops systematic understanding of the forces that destabilize regimes and the strategies that preserve them. He recognizes tragic dimensions of politics, where achieving stability may require accepting injustice, while pursuing perfect justice may risk chaos. The art of the legislator involves navigating these tensions with practical wisdom, creating arrangements that are as just as circumstances allow while stable enough to endure. This requires understanding human nature, social dynamics, the specific character of one's own city, and the delicate balance between competing conceptions of justice that political life necessarily involves. Book 5 equips serious students of politics with analytical frameworks for understanding revolution and constitutional preservation that remain relevant for understanding political instability today.
Having analyzed revolution and constitutional preservation in Book 5, Aristotle turns in Book 6 to detailed institutional design for democracies and oligarchies. This book is the most technical and institutionally focused in the politics. Where earlier books addressed fundamental philosophical questions about justice, citizenship, and the purpose of political community, Book 6 operates at the level of practical constitutional engineering. How should offices be structured? Who should hold them? How should they be selected? What powers should different bodies have? These questions might seem mundane compared to grand philosophical issues, but Aristotle understands that institutional details profoundly affect how constitutions actually function. Good principles without good institutional design produce bad governance. Book 6 provides the practical knowledge needed to implement democratic or oligarchic constitutions effectively. Aristotle begins by recalling the varieties of democracy identified in Book 4. Not all democracies are identical. They differ based on which classes participate, how inclusive citizenship is, and how much power rests with institutions versus the assembled people. The most moderate democracy has property qualifications for office, but sets them low enough that most free citizens can meet them. Laws rule supreme, and the assembly's power is limited. The most extreme democracy allows all residents to participate regardless of birth or property, with the assembled people sovereign over law itself and decisions made by whoever shows up on any given day. Between these extremes lie several intermediate varieties. Understanding these varieties is essential because institutional design must fit the type of democracy. What works for moderate democracy will fail in extreme democracy, and vice versa. The fundamental principle of democracy is equality. Democrats believe all free citizens are equally free, and therefore should share equally in political power. This principle manifests in several institutional features characteristic of democracies. First, offices are filled by lot rather than election. Lottery ensures equal chance for every citizen to hold office, preventing the wealthy or well-born or eloquent from monopolizing power through electoral advantage. When offices are distributed randomly, everyone has equal opportunity to govern. Second, no office is held for life or long terms. Rotation ensures that ruling and being ruled are shared equally over time. If the same people held office permanently, equality would be violated. Third, the same person doesn't hold the same office repeatedly, or at least not frequently. This again distributes the experience of governing widely, rather than creating a permanent political class. Fourth, offices require no property qualification or only very low ones. This ensures poverty doesn't exclude citizens from participation. Fifth, the popular assembly and popular juries are sovereign, making final decisions on laws, policies, and judgments. Since all citizens participate in assembly and juries, this embodies direct rule by the people. However, Aristotle notes that not all these features can be implemented simultaneously in every democracy without creating dysfunction. A completely unqualified democracy, where anyone can hold any office selected by pure lottery, often produces incompetent administration. Some offices require technical knowledge or experience that random selection doesn't ensure.
A wise democracy, therefore, mixes principles. Offices requiring specialized knowledge might be filled by election from qualified candidates, allowing democratic choice while ensuring competence. Less technical positions can be filled by lottery. Terms can be short, but not so short that officials never gain experience.
The assembly can be sovereign on major questions, while delegating administrative details to qualified magistrates. The art of democratic constitutional design lies in achieving genuine equality and popular participation while maintaining effective governance. Aristotle examines specific democratic institutions in detail. The assembly should meet regularly and be accessible to all citizens. In agricultural democracies, where citizens are scattered across the countryside, assemblies should meet infrequently enough that farmers can attend without neglecting their land, but frequently enough to maintain democratic control. In urban commercial democracies, with citizens concentrated in the city, assemblies can meet more frequently. Payment for assembly attendance helps ensure poor citizens can participate without losing wages. Popular juries should be large, drawn broadly from the citizenry, to embody collective judgment rather than the views of a few individuals. Large juries are also harder to corrupt, since bribing hundreds of jurors is far more difficult than bribing a single judge or small panel. Magistrates in democracies should have clearly defined, limited powers. Democratic theory distrusts concentrating authority in individuals. Magistracies should be numerous, specialized, and checked by other offices and by the assembly. Term limits prevent any one individual from accumulating too much power or becoming entrenched. Accountability mechanisms are crucial. Democratic magistrates should be subject to audit and review at the end of their terms. If they've governed corruptly or incompetently, well, they can be punished. This accountability to the people makes democracy democratic. Officials are servants of the citizenry, not masters. The council or bulla, a smaller body that prepares business for the assembly, should be selected broadly from citizens. It can provide continuity and organization that the assembly lacks while remaining democratically accountable. In some democracies, the council is selected by lot. In others, different tribes or districts elect representatives. The key is ensuring it represents the whole demos, not a narrow faction. Military offices present special problems for democracies. Military effectiveness requires discipline, hierarchy, and often quick decisions by commanders without assembly deliberation. Yet giving generals too much power and independence threatens democracy. Many democracies fell when successful generals used their armies to establish tyrannies. Democratic armies should therefore be structured to maintain democratic control while enabling military effectiveness. Generals can be elected based on military competence, recognizing that lottery is inappropriate for positions requiring expertise. But their terms should be limited. They should be subject to civilian oversight, and they should command citizen militias rather than professional armies, personally loyal to commanders. Citizens fighting as soldiers maintain democratic spirit and prevent military power from becoming independent of democratic institutions. Having detailed democratic institutions, Aristotle turns to oligarchy. The fundamental principle of oligarchy is that political power should correspond to wealth and property. Oligarchs argue that those who contribute more to the city through property and resources should have more say in governance. This principle manifests in institutional features characteristic of oligarchies. First, offices have property qualifications, often substantial ones, excluding the poor from participation. The higher the qualification, the narrower the oligarchy. Second, offices are filled by election rather than lottery. This allows the wealthy to select from among themselves based on reputation, family connections, and perceived ability.
Third, offices may be held for long terms or even for life. Since oligarchs believe rule should go to the qualified and qualification correlates with wealth, there's no reason to constantly rotate offices. Fourth, power concentrates in councils and magistrates rather than popular assemblies. Oligarchs distrust mass decision-making, preferring deliberation among the qualified few. Fifth, wealth itself may be hereditary and political power follows family lines, creating an aristocracy of wealth. However, just as with democracy, different varieties of oligarchy exist. The most moderate oligarchy sets property qualifications low enough to include the middle class, creating a fairly broad ruling group. Election and rule of law constrain the wealthy from acting arbitrarily. The higher the qualification, the narrower the oligarchy. Second, offices may be held for long terms or even for life. Since oligarchs believe rule should go to the qualified and qualification correlates with wealth, there's no reason to constantly rotate offices. Fourth, power concentrates in councils and magistrates rather than popular assemblies. Oligarchs distrust mass decision-making, preferring deliberation among the qualified few. Fifth, wealth itself may be hereditary and political power follows family lines, creating an aristocracy of wealth.
However, just as with democracy, different varieties of oligarchy exist. The most moderate oligarchy sets property qualifications low enough to include the middle class, creating a fairly broad ruling group. Election and the rule of law constrain the wealthy from acting arbitrarily. The most extreme oligarchy restricts power to a tiny elite who may govern without legal constraints, essentially treating the city as their private property. Wise oligarchs recognize that extremely narrow and oppressive oligarchy breeds revolution. A stable oligarchy should be relatively broad, include capable citizens of moderate wealth, governed according to law, and provide some justice and public goods even to the poor. This requires institutional design that channels oligarchic principles toward moderation. Aristotle examines specific oligarchic institutions. Councils in oligarchies are typically powerful bodies where the wealthy deliberate about policy and administration. Unlike democratic councils that prepare business for popular assemblies, oligarchic councils make final decisions themselves. Membership might be restricted to the wealthiest citizens, perhaps selected by election from among property qualifiers, or co-opted, where current members select new members from qualified candidates. Long or life terms ensure continuity and prevent the poor from cycling into power. However, overly narrow councils breed factionalism, as oligarchs compete for limited positions. Broader councils that include the moderately wealthy are more stable. Magistrates in oligarchies are fewer and more powerful than in democracies. Oligarchs prefer concentrating authority in qualified individuals rather than distributing it widely. But this creates danger if magistrates act oppressively. Wise oligarchies maintain legal restraints on magistrates and accountability mechanisms, even if accountability is to other oligarchs rather than to the people. Courts in oligarchies may be staffed by the wealthy or their appointees. Oligarchs distrust popular juries, but blatantly corrupt courts that deny justice to the poor fuel revolutionary resentment. A prudent oligarchy maintains reasonably fair courts, especially for ordinary civil and criminal matters, while perhaps reserving political cases for oligarchic judges.
Assemblies in oligarchies are typically weak or non-existent. If assemblies exist, they may include all free citizens but have limited powers, perhaps only approving or rejecting proposals from oligarchic councils without amendment or deliberation. Or assembly voting may be weighted by wealth classes, so the wealthy's votes count more. These arrangements give a democratic appearance while maintaining oligarchic reality. Military organization in oligarchies often involve the wealthy serving as cavalry, the most prestigious and expensive military role, while the poor serve as light infantry, if at all. This military hierarchy reinforces political hierarchy. However, if the city needs large infantry forces, excluding the poor from effective military roles weakens the city militarily. Wise oligarchs recognize that military necessity may require arming and training the poor, which then creates pressure for political inclusion, since those who fight for the city demand voice in governing it. Aristotle emphasizes throughout that the key to stable democracy or oligarchy is moderation and concern for the excluded. Democracies should protect property and include the wealthy in some offices based on competence. This gives the wealthy stake in the democratic constitution and prevents them from becoming desperate enemies. Oligarchies should provide justice and basic public goods to the poor and include the moderately wealthy in government. This prevents the poor from revolting out of desperation and the moderately wealthy from revolutions out of frustrated ambition. Both types should maintain strong rule of law rather than allowing those in power to act arbitrarily. Law-governed democracy and law-governed oligarchy are far more stable than regimes where power is unconstrained. Aristotle also addresses public finance and revenue, which affect institutional possibilities. Democracies need revenue to pay citizens for assembly attendance, jury service, and office holding. Without payment, poor citizens can't afford to participate, transforming democracy into oligarchy in practice, even with democratic institutions formally. Revenue sources for democracies might include public lands rented to tenants, harbor fees in maritime cities, court fees and fines, taxes on resident aliens, and trade or conquered territories. The challenge is funding democratic participation without excessive taxation that harms economic productivity. Oligarchies typically oppose public payment for political participation, seeing it as demagogic bribery. They prefer unpaid offices, which automatically restricts participation to those who can afford to serve without compensation. However, oligarchies still need revenue for defense, public works, and administration. They may rely more on liturgies, where wealthy individuals fund public services, gaining honor while maintaining that taxation is minimal. The practical wisdom of the legislator involves balancing multiple considerations. Democratic institutions should embody equality and popular participation while ensuring competent administration. Oligarchic institutions should reflect the wealthy's greater stake and capacity while avoiding oppression that breeds revolution. Both types should maintain law, provide justice, and generate enough revenue to function without crippling the economy. The specific institutional design must fit the particular city's social composition, economy, military needs, and traditions. Aristotle provides not a single blueprint, but analytical frameworks for thinking through these complex trade-offs. Book 6 might seem tedious in its institutional detail, but this misses its importance. Political philosophy without institutional knowledge remains abstract and impractical. We need to understand not just that democracy means rule by the people, or that oligarchy means rule by the wealthy, but how these principles translate into specific offices, selection mechanisms, decision procedures, and accountability structures. Different institutional arrangements produce dramatically different outcomes even within the same general constitutional type. The difference between stable democracy and unstable democracy, between moderate and oppressive oligarchy, often lies in institutional details. A legislator equipped with Book 6's knowledge can design institutions that make constitutional principles work effectively in practice. This is political science as genuine craft knowledge, the practical wisdom needed to construct and maintain political communities. Combined with the philosophical principles established in earlier books, Book 6 helps complete Aristotle's comprehensive account of political life, addressing both the highest theoretical questions and the most practical institutional challenges. After 6 books examining actual constitutions, their varieties, their instabilities, and their institutional arrangements, Aristotle finally turns in Book 7 to the question that has been implicit throughout: what is the best constitution in the absolute sense? Not the best practical constitution for cities with difficult circumstances, not the best way to preserve an existing oligarchy or democracy, but the best constitution without qualification, the regime that would enable human beings to live the best life possible. This return to the ideal might seem like backtracking after so much practical analysis, but it's essential. All the practical discussions in earlier books presuppose some understanding of what political life aims at ultimately. Now Aristotle makes that understanding explicit and systematic. Book 7 is deeply connected to Aristotle's ethical philosophy, particularly the Nicomachean Ethics. To understand the best constitution, we must first understand the best life for human beings, since the purpose of political community is enabling that life. Aristotle begins by asking what constitutes happiness or the good life. This is the same question that opens the Ethics, and the answer is fundamentally the same. The best life is the life of virtue, the life spent developing and exercising our distinctively human capacities excellently. This includes both moral virtues like courage, temperance, justice, and generosity, and intellectual virtues like practical wisdom and philosophical contemplation. A happy life isn't determined by external goods like wealth, pleasure, or power, though these have supporting roles. Happiness consists in excellent activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. This immediately raises a tension that runs throughout Book 7. What is the relationship between the political life and the philosophical life? Is the best life one of active engagement in politics, ruling and being ruled, participating in the city's decisions and deliberations? Or is the best life one of philosophical contemplation withdrawn from political turmoil to pursue theoretical understanding? Greek culture debated this question intensely. Some admired the philosopher who withdraws from politics to pursue truth. Others admire the statesman who engages actively in governing the city. Aristotle's answer is characteristically balanced and nuanced. The completely solitary contemplative life, withdrawn entirely from political community, is not the best human life. We are by nature political animals. Complete isolation from others is neither possible nor desirable for human flourishing. We need friends, family, fellow citizens. Our moral virtues require social context for their exercise. Justice makes no sense outside of community. Generosity requires others to benefit. Even contemplation is enhanced through discussion with other philosophers. Moreover, caring about others and about our community's welfare is part of human excellence, not a distraction from it. The person who cares nothing for others' good and lives entirely for private satisfaction is morally deficient. However, the life completely absorbed in political activity to the exclusion of contemplation is also not the best life. Political action is important, but it's not the highest human activity. Politics serves human flourishing. It's not itself the ultimate form of flourishing. The person who spends every moment in political maneuvering, never engaging in philosophical inquiry or contemplation of truth, misses the highest activities humans are capable of. The best life combines both dimensions. It includes political engagement and the exercise of moral virtues in community with others, but it also includes leisure for contemplation, intellectual development, and the pursuit of understanding. The truly happy person participates in political life when appropriate, but also has time and capacity for philosophical activity. This combined life requires external conditions that make it possible, which brings us back to constitutional design. What conditions does the best life require? First, adequate material resources. We need food, shelter, health, basic comfort. Extreme poverty makes virtue and contemplation nearly impossible when all energy goes to survival. However, great wealth is not required and may actually corrupt. Moderate prosperity, sufficient for leisure and education, serves best. Second, physical and mental health. Disease, disability, and mental impairment can prevent full development of our capacities. The best life requires bodies and minds functioning well enough to support virtuous activity. Third, supportive relationships. We need family, friends, and fellow citizens who share our values and support our development. Human excellence develops through relationships with others who challenge us, inspire us, and collaborate with us. Fourth, good education. We're not born with fully developed virtue or wisdom. These must be cultivated through proper upbringing and training. Without education, our capacities remain undeveloped. Fifth, leisure. If we must work constantly just to survive, we lack time for the activities that constitute the good life. Leisure doesn't mean idleness, but freedom from necessary labor to engage in higher activities. Sixth, a well-ordered political community. Just laws, stable institutions, and a culture that values excellence create the framework within which individual flourishing occurs. The best constitution is therefore the one that provides these conditions for as many citizens as possible. It creates a community where citizens can develop moral and intellectual virtue, engage in political participation, pursue philosophical understanding, and live excellent lives together. This requires addressing several dimensions: the city's size and location, its economic arrangements, its population's character, its educational system, and its constitutional structure. Aristotle addresses each systematically. Consider first the city's territory and natural resources. The best city needs territory adequate to support its population with moderate prosperity, but not so abundant that citizens become soft and luxury-loving. It should be defensible against invasion with natural barriers or strong positions. Access to the sea is valuable for trade and communication, but also brings dangers of moral corruption from foreign influences and the restless commercial character of maritime cities. The ideal is perhaps a city near the sea, but not directly on it, connected by a port town, but maintaining some distance from maritime culture. The climate should be moderate, neither the extreme cold that makes people fierce and thoughtless, nor the extreme heat that makes them soft and slavish. Greece's temperate climate helps explain why Greeks developed such excellent political culture, in Aristotle's admittedly biased view. The land should be varied enough to support diverse agriculture and moderate self-sufficiency without complete autarky or complete dependence on trade. The population size is crucial. The city should be large enough to be self-sufficient in essential needs and to maintain effective military defense. A tiny city is vulnerable to conquest and can't provide the full range of functions a complete political community requires. However, the city should not be so large that citizens can't know each other or that governance becomes impersonal and bureaucratic. Citizens should be able to recognize each other, know each other's characters, and participate meaningfully in political deliberation. The city should be surveyable, comprehensible as a whole to its citizens. Aristotle suggests the ideal size is the largest population that can still function as a genuine community where citizens know one another. This is clearly far smaller than modern nation-states, probably something like tens of thousands of citizens at most, which was considered large for a Greek polis. The population's character matters as much as its size. The best city needs citizens capable of virtue and political participation. This raises troubling questions about who should be citizens and what roles various groups should play. Aristotle's views here are deeply problematic and reflect ancient prejudices we must reject. He assumes that only free Greek males of citizen birth can be full citizens. Women, resident foreigners, and slaves are excluded from citizenship and assigned subordinate roles. We've already discussed in Book 1 how Aristotle's defense of natural slavery is morally repugnant. Here, he compounds the error by building these exclusions into his ideal constitution. He argues that the best city needs a class of farmers and craftsmen who are not citizens but rather slaves or subordinate workers, freeing citizens for political participation and philosophical activity. This allows citizens to have leisure while necessary labor gets done. Modern readers rightfully reject this entirely. The idea that some human beings exist merely to provide labor for others' flourishing is incompatible with basic human dignity and equality. Aristotle's ideal city is built on exploitation. However, we can separate the core insight from the morally defective application. The core insight is that the good life requires leisure, and that producing this leisure requires labor. Aristotle's error is assuming this means some people must be permanently subordinated to others. Better solutions exist: technological advancement that reduces necessary labor, economic organization that distributes both work and leisure more equitably, or acceptance that everyone, including the most philosophically gifted, should contribute to necessary labor while also having time for higher pursuits. The fundamental question Aristotle raises, how do we organize society so people can pursue the good life rather than spending all time in survival labor, remains important even as we reject his aristocratic and exclusionary answer. The best constitution itself, in terms of political structure, resembles the mixed constitution, or polity, that Aristotle praised in Book 4. It gives all virtuous citizens a share in governments while ensuring that the most capable and virtuous have greatest influence. It combines elements of democracy, aristocracy, and possibly limited monarchy. The exact institutional structure matters less than the principles: rule of law rather than arbitrary power, participation by all capable citizens rather than narrow oligarchy, selection of officials based on virtue and ability rather than wealth or birth alone, constitutional arrangements that check any individual or group from dominating, and institutions that foster virtue rather than rewarding vice. However, what truly distinguishes the best constitution is not primarily institutional structure, but education. Aristotle insists repeatedly that the legislator's most important task is educating citizens. Good laws matter, but good character matters more. Without virtuous citizens, even the best institutional arrangements will fail. With virtuous citizens, even imperfect institutions can work reasonably well. Education must therefore be the central concern of any serious political community, and absolutely the central concern of the best constitution. Education should be public, not left to individual families. The whole community has a stake in developing good citizens. Education should begin in childhood and continue throughout life. It should address both body and soul, both character and intellect. Physical education develops healthy, strong bodies and cultivates certain virtues like courage and self-control. However, it shouldn't be harsh and militaristic like Spartan training. The goal is not producing fierce warriors, but healthy citizens capable of both war and peace. Musical education, in the broad Greek sense, including poetry, music, and the arts, cultivates aesthetic sensibility and emotional development. Music shapes the soul, habituating us to take pleasure in noble things and pain in base things. The right music makes us better people by attuning our emotions to virtue. This is why the city must regulate music and arts, excluding forms that corrupt character while promoting those that improve it. Moral education develops the virtues through habituation and practice. Children learn courage by practicing brave acts, temperance by practicing self-control, justice by practicing fair dealing. This habituation must occur before rational understanding develops. We become virtuous by acting virtuously, developing good habits that eventually become second nature. Intellectual education develops rational capacities. This includes practical wisdom, the ability to deliberate well about how to live and act. It also includes theoretical wisdom, the capacity for philosophical understanding of reality's fundamental nature. The highest education aims at contemplation, the activity Aristotle considers the peak of human flourishing. The educational system should progress from physical training in early childhood, through moral habituation and basic literacy, through more advanced study of music and mathematics, ultimately to philosophy for those capable of it. Not every citizen will reach the highest levels of philosophical education, but every citizen should develop virtue and practical wisdom. The education system is more important than any other constitutional feature because it determines what kind of citizens the city will have.
Good education produces good citizens who will maintain and improve the Constitution. Bad education produces bad citizens who will corrupt it regardless of institutional safeguards.
Aristotle emphasizes that education must continue throughout life, not end in youth. The city should provide opportunities for adult citizens to engage in philosophical discussion, attend cultural performances, participate in religious festivals, and continue developing intellectually and morally. The complete city isn't just a governing structure, but a comprehensive culture that shapes citizens' whole lives toward excellence. This vision of political community is demanding and ambitious. The best constitution aims at nothing less than making citizens excellent human beings living excellent lives together. This requires attending to every dimension of human development: physical, moral, intellectual, cultural, and spiritual. It requires economic arrangements that provide adequate resources without encouraging greed or luxury. It requires institutions that enable participation while ensuring competent governance. It requires laws that promote virtue while respecting freedom. Most importantly, it requires education that develops human capacities from childhood through old age. Is such a constitution achievable? Aristotle is realistic about the difficulties. The best constitution requires conditions rarely met: adequate territory and resources, a population of appropriate size and character, legislators with wisdom to design good institutions and education, and commitment from citizens to the common project of living excellently together. Most cities face harsher circumstances and must settle for less ideal arrangements. But understanding the best constitution matters even if we can't fully realize it. It provides the standard by which we evaluate actual constitutions. It clarifies what political life aims at ultimately. It guides reform efforts by showing what direction improvement should take. Even if we can't reach the ideal, we can move toward it. Book 7 thus articulates the telos of political community, the ultimate purpose that makes sense of all the practical discussions in earlier books. Politics isn't ultimately about stability or power or wealth. It's about enabling human beings to live well, to develop and exercise the capacities that make us distinctively human, to achieve happiness through virtue and contemplation in community with others. The best constitution is simply the one that serves this purpose most fully.
Book 8 continues directly from Book 7's discussion of the best constitution, focusing entirely on education. This book is incomplete as we have it. Aristotle's treatment breaks off suddenly, and scholars believe additional material was lost or never finished. What survives concentrates particularly on musical education, which might seem narrow or odd to modern readers. Why does Aristotle devote so much attention to music specifically? The answer reveals something profound about ancient Greek understanding of education and human formation. For the Greeks, musike, music in the broad sense, included not just instrumental music and song, but poetry, dance, and the arts generally. Music was understood as shaping the soul, forming character, and habituating emotions. It wasn't mere entertainment or decoration, but a powerful educational force. Aristotle begins by reiterating education's centrality to political life. The legislator who aims at making citizens good must above all attend to education. This isn't optional or secondary, it's the primary task. Good laws matter, but they depend on citizens with character and judgment to maintain and apply them well. Without proper education producing virtuous citizens, even the best constitutional structure will decay. With good education producing excellent citizens, even imperfect institutions can function reasonably well. Therefore, education must be a public concern, regulated and provided by the city, not left to individual families with varying standards and aims.
The city has the strongest stake in ensuring all citizens receive proper formation. This raises an immediate question that remains contested today. Should education be uniform for all citizens or differentiated based on their different roles and capacities? Aristotle recognizes the tension. On one hand, the city needs citizens with various skills and capacities. Some will govern, others will serve in military roles, others will engage in various productive activities. Different roles require different training. On the other hand, all citizens share in the common project of the Constitution. They all need basic moral virtue, understanding of the city's values, and capacity to participate in civic life. Moreover, in the best constitution, citizens should be capable of both ruling and being ruled in turn, which requires comprehensive education rather than narrow training for specific functions. Aristotle's solution emphasizes what's common. All citizens should receive the same basic education in virtue, music, letters, physical training, and drawing. This common education creates shared culture, shared values, and shared capacity for civic participation. It makes citizens truly fellow citizens rather than just people who happen to live in the same place. Specialized training for particular roles can come later and can supplement but shouldn't replace this common foundation. The city educates citizens primarily as citizens, not primarily as farmers or soldiers or craftsmen. This common civic education is what makes political community possible.
What should this education include? Aristotle identifies 4 traditional subjects: reading and writing, physical education, music, and drawing. Some add useful subjects like mathematics or practical skills. The question is, what principle should guide the curriculum? Should education focus on what's useful, what develops virtue, or what enables leisure activities? Aristotle argues we need all 3, but in proper order and proportion. Useful knowledge matters because we live in a world where practical needs must be met. Citizens should be literate and numerate. They should understand enough about agriculture, warfare, household management, and crafts to function effectively. However, education shouldn't be narrowly vocational or utilitarian. We don't educate citizens merely to make them economically productive. That reduces education to training and misses its higher purposes. Education should develop virtue, forming character so citizens habitually choose and act rightly. This is more important than mere useful knowledge. A citizen with excellent character but limited technical skills contributes more to the city than a skilled but vicious person. Character formation happens through habituation in childhood and adolescence, practicing virtuous actions until they become second nature, being exposed to good examples and learning to take pleasure in noble actions and pain in base ones. This moral education shapes the whole person, not just imparting information, but transforming desires, emotions, and dispositions. Finally, education should prepare citizens for leisure, for the activities that constitute the good life, rather than merely enabling survival. This is the highest educational aim.
Humans don't exist merely to work. Work serves life. But the good life consists in activities pursued for their own sake: philosophical inquiry, artistic appreciation, friendship, political participation, and contemplation. Education should develop capacities for these excellent activities that make life worth living. Physical education requires careful balance. The body must be strong and healthy to support the soul's activities. Physical weakness, disease, and poor health impede virtue and contemplation. Therefore, cities should ensure children receive proper nutrition, exercise, and physical training. However, physical education shouldn't be harsh, exhausting, or exclusively focused on military prowess, as in Sparta. Spartan training produces fierce warriors but damages children's development and makes citizens incapable of living well in peace. The goal is health and strength sufficient for both war and peace, both action and contemplation. Physical training should be moderate, appropriate to different ages, and complemented by intellectual and moral development. Children in early years should engage in play and movement that develops their bodies naturally without excessive strain. Organized athletic training should begin later, after basic physical development is established. Adolescents can engage in more vigorous training, but still avoiding the brutal exhaustion characteristic of professional athletics. Aristotle criticizes the Greek obsession with athletic competitions and Olympic victors. These extreme athletes develop bodies suited for specialized competitions, but not for the well-rounded life of good citizens. They overtrain in youth, often damaging their health, and rarely maintain physical excellence into adulthood. The ideal is regular, moderate exercise that maintains health and strength throughout life, not peak performance in youth followed by decline. Music education receives Aristotle's most extensive attention in Book 8, though the discussion breaks off before completion. Why does music matter so much? Because music has unique power to shape the soul and character. This isn't mysticism, but empirical observation. We all experience how music affects our emotional states. Certain music makes us feel courageous, other music melancholic, other music frenzied or calm or joyful or angry. Music doesn't just express emotions, it induces them. When we listen to music, we don't merely observe emotions from outside, we experience them. Our souls are moved and shaped by musical forms. Moreover, music represents or imitates character directly. Unlike other arts where imitation is more distant, music in its rhythms, harmonies, and melodies directly embodies qualities of character: courage, temperance, license, nobility, baseness. When we engage with music over time, we habituate ourselves to the character it embodies. If we constantly listen to music expressing base or licentious character, our own characters are gradually corrupted. If we engage with music expressing noble character, we are improved. This makes music a powerful educational tool, but also a potential danger requiring regulation. Aristotle distinguishes different musical modes, scales characterized by different arrangements of intervals and producing different emotional effects. The Dorian mode produces stable, courageous character. The Phrygian mode induces enthusiasm and religious frenzy. The Lydian mode softens and relaxes. The Mixolydian creates melancholy. These aren't arbitrary associations, but reflect real psychological effects that Greeks observed and theorized about. Different modes are appropriate for different purposes and ages. The Dorian mode is most suitable for educating the young, habituating them to courageous, moderate character. The Phrygian mode might be appropriate for religious festivals, where emotional release serves beneficial purposes. The Lydian mode relaxes, useful for mature citizens who need relief from labor, but potentially corrupting for the young who should be developing strong character. Similarly, different rhythms produce different effects. Some rhythms are stable and orderly, others frenzied and dissolute. Education should employ stable rhythms that reinforce good character, while avoiding rhythms that encourage licentiousness. The same applies to melodies and the way different instruments are used. Some music is noble and elevating, other music vulgar and corrupting. The educated citizen should be able to distinguish and should habitually engage with the noble while avoiding the vulgar. This raises practical questions about musical education. Should citizens learn to perform music themselves or only to listen and judge? Should they master instruments and achieve high performance levels, or learn just enough to appreciate music properly?
Aristotle argues that children should learn to perform music to some degree. Active engagement with music teaches appreciation far better than passive listening. Someone who has struggled to master an instrument, to produce beautiful sounds and execute rhythms properly, understands music far more deeply than someone who only listens. The discipline of musical practice also develops character, patience, attention, the satisfaction of gradual mastery, aesthetic discrimination. However, citizens shouldn't aim at professional virtuosity. Excessive devotion to musical performance transforms music from education into craft or entertainment. Professional musicians often must master vulgar, popular music to earn living. They develop technical facility, but may lose the higher appreciation that distinguishes noble from base music. They perform for others' pleasure rather than engaging with music as part of the good life. The goal is that citizens should be competent amateur musicians who can participate in musical culture actively, appreciate excellence, and use music properly in their own lives and education of their children. They should reach a level of performance ability sufficient for genuine understanding, then transition to being educated listeners and judges rather than performers. This typically means intensive musical training in youth, learning to play instruments and sing, then in adulthood maintaining appreciation while no longer practicing extensively. Musical education thus serves multiple functions simultaneously. It develops aesthetic sensibility, the capacity to perceive and appreciate beauty. It habituates emotions and desires properly, teaching us to feel pleasure and pain at the right things. It provides appropriate leisure activity, something pursued for its own sake rather than for external reward. It creates common culture, shared artistic traditions that unite citizens. It develops character through the discipline of practice and through exposure to music embodying virtue. Aristotle emphasizes that music's effects depend on its content and form, not just its presence. Not all music is educational or beneficial. Much music is merely entertaining or even corrupting. Therefore, cities must regulate musical education and musical culture more broadly. They should ensure children are exposed to music that will improve their character while protecting them from music that would corrupt them. This doesn't mean crude censorship or Philistine suspicion of all art. It means thoughtful curation by those who understand music's psychological effects and educational purposes. Music that expresses and induces noble emotions, stable character, and excellence should be promoted. Music that expresses and induces baseness, licentiousness, or excessive emotion should be limited or excluded, especially from children's education. Adults with formed characters can engage with a wider range of music, including some that would harm children, because mature virtue provides resistance to corruption. Even here, however, Aristotle suggests limits. Music so base or corrupting that it damages even mature character should be avoided. The completely licentious rhythms that characterized some popular entertainment should not be part of civic musical culture. This balance between cultural regulation and freedom remains contested. Aristotle clearly favors substantial civic involvement in education and culture, ensuring that musical and artistic culture serves virtue and the good life rather than mere pleasure or commercial profit. Modern liberal societies tend toward greater individual freedom in cultural choices and skepticism about state regulation of arts and education. Yet, Aristotle's core insight remains challenging. If music and culture genuinely shape character, and if character determines whether we live well or badly, can we simply leave cultural formation to market forces and individual choice? Or does the political community have legitimate interest in cultivating culture that improves rather than corrupts citizens? The book breaks off abruptly in the middle of discussing musical modes and education. We don't know what else Aristotle planned to say about education. Presumably, he would have addressed reading and writing, drawing, mathematics, and the transition from childhood education to adult philosophical study. He might have discussed in more detail how education should differ at various ages and how the educational system should be administered. The loss is frustrating because education is so central to Aristotle's political thought. However, what survives conveys the essential vision. Education is the heart of good political community. It forms citizens with character and capacity to live excellent lives together. It requires attending to body, emotions, character, and intellect. It must be public, common to all citizens, and guided by understanding of human excellence. It prepares citizens for both the necessary business of life and the higher activities that make life worth living. With Book 8, the politics as we have it concludes, though incompletely.
Aristotle has provided comprehensive treatment of political life, from fundamental questions about human nature and the purpose of political community, through empirical analysis of constitutional varieties and practical advice for institutional design, to philosophical reflection on the best life and education. The Politics doesn't answer every question or resolve every tension. Aristotle acknowledges tragic dimensions of political life where goods conflict and choices involve loss. He recognizes that perfect justice and perfect stability may be incompatible. He accepts that different cities need different arrangements. But he provides frameworks for thinking about these challenges philosophically and practically. He shows how empirical investigation and philosophical reflection complement each other in understanding political life. And he articulates the vision that has animated serious political thought ever since: that political community exists not merely for survival or prosperity, but for enabling human beings to live excellently, developing and exercising our distinctive capacities in common life governed by justice and law. This vision, even where we disagree with Aristotle's specific conclusions, continues to challenge and inspire anyone who thinks seriously about how we should live together and what political community is for.
We've journeyed through all 8 books of Aristotle's Politics, from the foundational claim that humans are political animals through detailed analysis of constitutional forms, institutional design, revolution, and education. Now it's worth stepping back to consider why this ancient text, written over 2,000 years ago for Greek city-states that no longer exist, remains essential reading for anyone thinking seriously about political life today. Aristotle's influence on Western political thought is difficult to overstate. The Politics didn't simply contribute to political philosophy, it largely created political philosophy as a systematic discipline. Before Aristotle, political reflection existed in various forms: Plato's dialogues, the constitutional debates recorded by historians like Thucydides, practical political rhetoric. But Aristotle transformed political thinking into a science in his sense, a systematic body of knowledge combining empirical investigation with theoretical analysis, classifying phenomena, identifying causes, and seeking general principles while attending to particular circumstances. The Politics established methods and questions that structured political thought for centuries. The six-fold classification of constitutions became a standard framework for analyzing regimes. The question of who should rule and for whose benefit shaped constitutional debates through medieval, Renaissance, and early modern periods. The tension between rule of law and rule of men remains central to political theory and practice. The analysis of revolution influenced everyone from medieval chroniclers to modern social scientists studying regime change. In medieval Europe, the Politics profoundly shaped Christian political theology after being reintroduced to the West through Arabic translations in the 12th and 13th centuries. Thomas Aquinas integrated Aristotelian political philosophy with Christian doctrine, arguing that political community is natural rather than merely a consequence of sin, that earthly government serves genuine good even apart from salvation, and that political participation develops human capacities as God intended. This baptized Aristotelianism provided theoretical foundation for increasingly complex medieval political institutions and helped justify secular political authority alongside ecclesiastical power. The medieval reception of Aristotle contributed to the development of constitutionalism, the idea that political authority should be limited by law and that rulers govern for the common good rather than private benefit. During the Renaissance and early modern period, Aristotle's Politics influenced republican thought in Italian city-states and later in other European contexts. Thinkers drawing on Aristotle emphasized civic virtue, mixed constitution, and the corruption that comes from excessive concentration of power or wealth. Machiavelli, though he broke with Aristotelian ethics in important ways, remained deeply influenced by the Politics' empirical approach and analysis of constitutional stability. The American founders drew on traditions of political thought influenced by Aristotle, particularly ideas about mixed constitution, checks and balances, and the importance of civic virtue for republican government.
Madison's Federalist 10 echoes Aristotelian concerns about faction and the dangers of extreme democracy or oligarchy. Modern political thought both built on and reacted against Aristotle. Liberal political theory, emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries, challenged key Aristotelian assumptions. Where Aristotle saw a political community as natural and prior to individuals, liberals emphasized individual rights existing prior to political society. Where Aristotle focused on virtue and the good life as political aims, liberals emphasized protecting individual freedom and enabling diverse conceptions of the good to coexist. Where Aristotle accepted significant inequality and hierarchy, liberals moved toward principles of equal rights and dignity. These aren't merely disagreements, but fundamental reorientations of political thinking. Yet even liberal theory often operates on terrain Aristotle mapped. Questions about constitutional design, institutional balance, the relationship between liberty and equality, the role of education in maintaining free societies, and how to prevent tyranny or mob rule all trace back to problems Aristotle identified. Modern social science, particularly comparative politics and political sociology, pursues Aristotelian projects with contemporary methods. When political scientists study why democracies succeed or fail, analyze how institutions shape political behavior, or examine relationships between economic structure and political stability, they're asking recognizably Aristotelian questions, even when reaching different answers.
What should we take from the politics today? Certainly not uncritical acceptance of all Aristotle's conclusions. We've noted throughout this discussion how Aristotle's defense of slavery, subordination of women, and exclusionary citizenship violate basic principles of human equality and dignity. These aren't minor errors, but serious moral failures that have been used to justify horrific injustices throughout history. Modern political thought rightly rejects these aspects of Aristotelian politics completely. We also face circumstances Aristotle couldn't imagine: the massive scale of modern nation-states, global economic interdependence, technological transformation, pluralistic societies with deep diversity of values and cultures, and the speed of social change create political challenges fundamentally different from those facing Greek city-states. Simple application of Aristotelian prescriptions to contemporary politics would be naive and likely disastrous. Yet, the politics offers enduring insights that transcend its historical context. First, Aristotle's insistence that political community serves higher purposes than mere survival or security remains vital. Against reductionist views that see politics as simply power struggles or economic arrangements, Aristotle reminds us that political life should enable human flourishing, the development of our capacities for virtue, understanding, and meaningful participation in common life. Even if we disagree about what flourishing means precisely, keeping this question central prevents political thought from becoming merely technical or cynical. Second, Aristotle's empirical approach, combining theoretical analysis with careful attention to how institutions actually function, provides essential methodology. Pure theorizing disconnected from political reality produces beautiful but useless abstractions. Pure description without theoretical framework produces data without understanding. Aristotle shows how to combine both dimensions.
Third, the emphasis on virtue and character rather than just institutional design remains crucial. Institutions matter enormously, but they depend on citizens and officials with appropriate virtues to make them work. Constitutional arrangements that function well with virtuous citizens may fail completely with corrupt ones. This means education, culture, and character formation are irreducibly important for political health, not secondary to getting institutions right. Fourth, Aristotle's attention to middle classes and the dangers of extreme inequality speaks powerfully to contemporary circumstances. Societies divided starkly between very wealthy and very poor, without substantial middle class balancing extremes, tend toward instability and injustice. This pattern Aristotle identified in ancient city-states appears in modern democracies as well.
His prescription, strengthening middle classes and preventing extreme concentration of wealth, remains relevant, even if implementation differs. Fifth, the analysis of how regimes decay and how to preserve constitutional order provides frameworks still useful for understanding political instability. The causes of revolution Aristotle identified, perceived injustice, excluded groups seeking inclusion, ruling class divisions, demagogues exploiting discontent, recur throughout history. Understanding these patterns helps diagnose contemporary challenges to democratic stability. Sixth, Aristotle's insistence that different circumstances require different arrangements, that there's no single best constitution for all cities, cautions against one-size-fits-all approaches to political development. The best constitution for one society might fail in another with different history, culture, and social structure. This pluralistic sensibility remains important for thinking about political development and democracy promotion.
Third, the emphasis on virtue and character rather than just institutional design remains crucial. Institutions matter enormously, but they depend on citizens and officials with appropriate virtues to make them work. Constitutional arrangements that function well with virtuous citizens may fail completely with corrupt ones. This means education, culture, and character formation are irreducibly important for political health, not secondary to getting institutions right. Fourth, Aristotle's attention to middle classes and the dangers of extreme inequality speaks powerfully to contemporary circumstances. Societies divided starkly between very wealthy and very poor, without substantial middle class balancing extremes, tend toward instability and injustice. This pattern Aristotle identified in ancient city-states appears in modern democracies as well. His prescription, strengthening middle classes and preventing extreme concentration of wealth, remains relevant, even if implementation differs. Fifth, the analysis of how regimes decay and how to preserve constitutional order provides frameworks still useful for understanding political instability. The causes of revolution Aristotle identified, perceived injustice, excluded groups seeking inclusion, ruling class divisions, demagogues exploiting discontent, recur throughout history. Understanding these patterns helps diagnose contemporary challenges to democratic stability. Sixth, Aristotle's insistence that different circumstances require different arrangements, that there's no single best constitution for all cities, cautions against one-size-fits-all approaches to political development. The best constitution for one society might fail in another with different history, culture, and social structure. This pluralistic sensibility remains important for thinking about political development and democracy promotion. Finally, perhaps most fundamentally, Aristotle keeps central the question of what political life is for. In contemporary political discourse, we often lose sight of ultimate purposes, debating policies and procedures without asking what human goods they serve. Aristotle insists we can't think clearly about constitutional design, institutional reform, or political priorities without some understanding of what constitutes human flourishing and how political community enables it. This doesn't mean imposing one controversial conception of the good life on everyone, but it does mean recognizing that political arrangements should be evaluated ultimately by whether they enable people to live good lives, developing their capacities and achieving genuine well-being in community with others. The Politics thus remains essential reading, not as a manual with direct applications, but as a systematic exploration of fundamental questions about political life. It shows how to think philosophically about politics, empirically yet theoretically, attending to both principles and particulars, combining ethical reflection with institutional analysis, learning from history while reasoning independently. It raises questions every serious political thinker must confront. What is political community for? Who should rule and how? What makes authority legitimate? How should we balance liberty and equality, stability and justice, individual goods and common goods? What role should the political community play in education and culture? How can constitutions be preserved? What economic arrangements serve political health?
Aristotle doesn't provide final answers to these questions. Political philosophy has progressed in many ways since the 4th century BCE, expanding moral horizons, developing new concepts and methods, and responding to transformed circumstances. But the questions Aristotle asked and the frameworks he provided for addressing them remain foundational. Anyone thinking seriously about politics today, whether as philosopher, citizen, or statesman, benefits from wrestling with the politics, learning from its insights while recognizing its limitations and continuing the project of understanding how human beings can live excellently together in political community. That project, which Aristotle advanced so powerfully, continues as long as humans reflect on how we should govern ourselves and what makes political life worth living.
That concludes our exploration for today. If you enjoyed this in-depth analysis, subscribe to Summarize This for more comprehensive summaries of history's most influential works. Share your thoughts in the comments and suggest which great book we should tackle next. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.